discussion on the resurrection. His argumentation so far has been to lay forth what we refer to simply as the gospel, or at least the core facts of the gospel, what was of primary importance, he said, which was the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus in the days immediately following his resurrection. And so he lays that down and he makes a statement. He says, and you believed this. So you believed that he died, that he was buried, and you also believed that he was resurrected. And then he goes into the fact that he was seen by several people, showing proofs. He's trying to prove these things that they had already believed. And then he says, but so how would you say there is no resurrection? If there's no resurrection, then he goes into verse 12 through about verse 18 there. He's dealing with specific things that happens. If there's no resurrection, our faith is in vain. If there's no resurrection, we're still in our sin. If there's no resurrection, our hope is gone. So all of these things are a result of no resurrection, which kind of begs the question, although Paul doesn't come out and say this, but it begs the question, if you're a Christian, why would you ever say there's no resurrection? What would be the point of denying the core tenets of of Christianity? In Acts chapter 1, I was reading this past week, and you remember when Jesus has ascended now, and the disciples are gathered, and it says Peter stood up in their midst, and he says, basically, now it's time to replace the one who is gone, Judas, right? And he says, we need someone who has traveled with us, literally traveled with us from the time of his baptism until his ascension, right? Until he's taken up from us. And it was for this specific purpose, it says, that he may preach or proclaim the resurrection with us. You see that? Even there, Peter recognizes that the central tenet of the Christian message is resurrection. And so it's not a light thing that they are denying the resurrection. It's a very serious thing, in fact. And so he comes in and he shows that, in fact, Christ has been raised. He's gone through several different arguments. But now he comes back to, and what's interesting is, at first it was Christ was resurrected. And then a little later is Christ is resurrected from the dead. Right? And so now it's the idea of how was or what kind of body. And I think that becomes central to this understanding. Were they denying, we asked the question at the beginning of chapter 15 back a few months ago, were they denying the resurrection as a whole? Or are they denying the resurrection as taught by Christ, or as taught by reality, we might say? Many of the Greco-Roman people believed in life after death. Most of them believed in life immediately after death, that as soon as the body died, the soul was released and it joined the eternal. And many of the Corinthians would have bought into that idea before Christ. And so the idea is, were they denying the resurrection as it is in reality in favor of their old Greco-Roman leanings and teachings? Or are they denying, resurrection completely? That, when you're dead, you're like Rover, you're dead all over type deal. That's it, we're done. And so I tend to think that he is dealing with a rejection of the resurrection body. And that's why when he comes down to this diatribe in verse 35, a diatribe is simply where the teacher asks a fictional enemy or opponent a question, and then they might come back. And so they, that's the idea of a discussion, I hate to say fake discussion, but there's no one actually there. He's making up the student as the teacher. He makes a statement as a teacher, the student might say, and then the teacher would reply, and the student might say, that type deal. That's a diatribe. And so we see that here. Someone will ask. So here's the student. He's going to ask the teacher, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come? And so there's a question of, is this two questions, two separate questions? How are the dead raised? And number two, with what kind of body do they come? Or is this a series in which the second question serves to further qualify or quantify the first question? How are the dead raised? Or in particular, what kind of body are they raised with? As if it's one full question. I tend to see it more as the full question, that what looks like a second question to us in English, at least in the ESV, is really a clarification of the first question. It's not just how are they raised, but in what manner, what kind of body are they raised with? And so the teacher, Paul in this case, answers in verse 36, "You foolish person." That's unusual language to us. And yet, why would Paul call them foolish people? Paul?
Well, the only thing I can think of is that he's probably preached this to them already and they've simply forgotten or ignored it.
Could have been. Yeah. Very well could have been. I mean, to me, like I asked at the beginning, if you're a Christian, why would you ever deny the resurrection, which is a central tenet to Christianity? That seems, we might say, foolish. Maybe Paul is calling them foolish based upon that. I think there's another reason why Paul uses this statement to them, "You foolish people," and it grabs attention. He's gone through a lot of argumentation here. Some of it very tedious, some of it cryptic to us. Maybe it was cryptic to them. And generally speaking, when you start going through in preaching, I'll just say in preaching, if you've gone through a lot of minutia and things start to get a little bogged down, that's where you insert a joke. Because you bring people's attention back to the moment again, right? It's in those moments that you do something a little out of the ordinary. And I think that's what Paul is doing here. He's arresting their attention in case they have forgotten what this is all about. There's a lot of intervening verses between, if the dead are not raised in verse 12, all the way down here to verse 35. Think about all the things that we have discussed in those short verses, and imagine them losing their train of thought as well. And so let's get everything back around to the point at hand. "You foolish persons, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain." Ron?
Could he also be referring back to what he was saying in chapter 1? To the Gentiles, the gospel is foolishness.
Yeah.
And what you're proposing here falls in that same category.
Right.
Where's the wise? Where's the dispute? He's had the wise, foolish discussion already.
Right.
And maybe he's reminding them, with this position, you're putting yourself in the foolish.
Absolutely. Very good point. And they're certainly putting themselves in that position of the fool. There's no doubt about it. And so calling them that is not, it's not a bad thing, because they are that. And I think it does help illustrate what they're teaching. If you believe this about the resurrection, then it's a foolish position. There's no soft soaping it at all. This isn't tender. This is direct. And so when we take a grain of wheat or a grain of corn or whatever, or kernel, and we plant it in the ground, he says that's not the body. Now, I know a lot of times today we go down to the nursery and we get starters. The tomato plant's already a starter, and the corn plant may already be a starter. Corn not so much, but we get starters of the plants. We get the body, right? That's what he's talking about here. We don't sow the body, we sow the seed. And then the seed produces the plant or the body. And that's what he's talking about. What you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel. Now, we have circumvented that a little bit in our modern age, but you couldn't just go down to the nursery in Corinth and pick up a pallet of tomato plants, right? You couldn't do that. you would keep your seeds from your last tomatoes that you ate, and then when the time came, you would plant those seeds. And then as James says in James chapter 5, you plant them in faith, that they're going to break forth sometime. And whatever the plant, that's what it was going to be. And so you take that tomato seed and you plant it, and then in a few months, whenever it produces fruit, you can eat that tomato, and inside the tomato is what? Seeds. And what do they look like? They look like the very first seed that you planted, right? Because there's continuity, right? Now Paul is emphasizing here, I believe, the discontinuity. And what's interesting is in this context, we're going to be using those words, continuity and discontinuity, a lot. Continuity simply means that it flows and is very similar. A discontinuity is that, it's dissimilar, okay? So he's emphasizing here the discontinuity of the seed, which is a bare kernel, and what comes forth from the ground. But in this discontinuity, there is still continuity, right? If it's a corn seed, it's going to bring forth what kind of plant? Corn. How many times? Every time. Every time it will produce a corn plant. A tomato seed will always produce a tomato. That's simply the way it is. And so there's continuity in that procreation order. And it goes all the way back to what? Genesis 1 and verse 12. He made the plants, and the herbs, and he says, each yielding seed after its own kind. This is we've referred to it, technically, the law of biogenesis. And that simply means that life creates life. The life that God created continues to create its own kind afterwards. Wheat, corn, tomato, apple to apple, whatever. And Paul is drawing upon those same truths. But in order for that seed to bring forth the plant, what has to happen to the seed? It has to die. Jesus said the very same thing in reference to himself in John chapter 12 and verse 24. Talking about he has to die in order for life to be produced. And so the death, in this case, gives birth to life. But God gives it a body, as he has chosen. Notice it's not as he chooses. God doesn't arbitrarily give bodies to seeds. I think this seed will take this body, and I think this seed will take this body. But rather, it's something that he had chosen at the creation. This seed will bring forth this plant. And that plant will yield this same kind of seed, which can be planted, bring forth that plant again, and again, and again, and again, and again, down through the ages. So God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of its seed its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there's one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. Right? There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, the glory of the earthly is of another. There's one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, for stars differ from star in glory. And so most see in verses 39 through 41, remember that idea of the chiasm, where you let me redo that, where you step in to a point and then you step back out of it, and that's what we have here. And so the first one is, not all flesh is the same, so it's not the same. And then the next part is there's different kinds. In this case, of animals, right? And then the central point is there are heavenly bodies. Let me see if I can spell this right. Heavenly and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, he says, and the glory of the earthly is another kind. Now in verse 41, he says, there's one glory of the sun, another of the moon, another of the stars. What does that sound like? One kind of humans, another for animals, another for bird, another for fish. See? And so you have this idea of the different kinds again that are specifically spoken. And then all stars differ, for stars differ from star in glory. And so, not all are the same. Right? So that's the chiastic structure here. And so the idea in verse 40 becomes kind of the highlight of this argument. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is of one kind and the glory of the earthly is another. So he's separating two distinct places, we might say. And that's going to come into play as we get further into this section. And that is that there's one of the heavenly and one of earth. Two places. And then he'll describe which one is the earthly and which one is the heavenly as he gets further along. But he's saying here there are two distinct kinds of bodies, the heavenly body and the earthly body. Now, he illustrates that, secondly, in verse 41, at the end of verse 40, about no, it is 41, the glory of the sun, the glory of the moon, and the glory of the stars, which are, we would say, celestial. He's putting them together with what we would call, with the heavenly, right? And so, in the original language, there is a word for the sky, and it's the same word for the space, what we would call space with the stars, and it's the same word that is used for the heavenly dwelling of God. And so there is overlap in the meaning. When you have one word that describes all those things, I think Paul is making a play off the word heavenly, and ultimately he's going to specify that that's talking about our eternal abode, heaven. But here, he just ranks it simply as the sun, moon, and stars, the celestial. Does it make sense? The word, by the way, is Uranus, where we get the name for the planet Uranus. Okay?
Because God makes each seed different, and he makes each category of seed different amongst the same category. Doesn't that seem like he's at work in everything that's created, even up to this day?
Yes.
It's uniquely different.
Yes. I would agree with that, absolutely. God did not simply wind up the earth like a top and let it go. That, by the way, is the theological idea of deism. That has a name, and it's deism, which says that there is a God. He created all things, wound it up like a clock, and now he's watching it run. Obviously, we are not deists. We believe that God continues to interact with his creation. And so that's different. By the way, some famous deists in our history, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, were both deists. Which is interesting because it was Ben Franklin who, in the First Continental Congress Convention, when they couldn't agree on anything, after about 10 days, stood up and said, I move that we pray every morning for the help of God to accomplish what we need to accomplish. I don't know why he would do that, because he didn't believe God was going to do anything, but I think he was at least commiserating with his fellow founders in seeking the help of God. He would go on to say, if the Lord, and he quotes from Psalm 127, if the Lord does not build the house, they labor in vain that build it. So anyway, that runs contrary to traditional deistic thought, but he considered himself a deist. Sometimes he referred to himself as a skeptic as well, but certainly had believed in a God, but not what we would, to the extent that we would. Anyway, that's a little off the subject. But yes, God didn't just wind things up and let it go. God has been interacting with us ever since. And that's why I think James says in James 5 that the farmer plants in hope, in faith. He believes God will bring forth those plants. Now, I know science, we go in, we say, well, the seed coat breaks open and the cotyledon breaks forth and pushes through the soil. And we've explained all of that. we don't really explain why all that happens, just the mechanism for it happening, not the power behind it happening, and that, I believe, is God. Okay, so he goes through these different ones, emphasizing the difference between heaven and earth, and he's going to build upon that then as we go a little bit further. So in verse 42, so it is with the resurrection of the dead. Now he's taking this seed principle of sowing and the body and it breaking forth and so forth. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. And it's interesting, the word sown here is, what did I say it was, Julie? I know it. Spiritai, and the one for raised up is ageritai, so they rhyme. There's other words for the idea of raising up. I think Paul uses this as a mnemonic aid. See how it helped me remember? Ageritai and spiritai. So you got to remember, most of these people heard these words read to them in church. And then they went home. And they didn't have a handout to take with them. They certainly didn't have a copy of the letter to take with them. Bullet points weren't listed on the door as they went out the church building. How did they remember any of this stuff? Well, you know, they were living at a time where memory was taught in school. Mnemonic aids were taught in school because that's how you went. You sat at the feet of Socrates. You didn't have notepads. You memorized it. You know, and it was that way in the first century. You had to memorize most of these things. Now, it was good because if you're talking to a group of 30 people that hear the same thing, and then, 3 days from now, those 20 people are back together and they're trying to remember what was said, well, it's easier because, one person remembers, another says, yeah, it was like that, but he used these words or something like, and so they begin to fill in one another, and so you have what we call a collective memory. So a lot of the things that were written with mnemonic aids built into them. Spiritai, ageritai. Spiritai, ageritai. Because he uses it several times in this context. Many believe Luke's travel narrative followed that. He was highlighting certain cities from Caesarea down to Jerusalem from chapter 9 through 19. And you just go down the list. It's a list of cities from north to south. And those cities, now what happened here? Oh, well, yeah, that was the story. What happened here? Well, there was that story. Because they didn't have notes to take home. They had to memorize. Especially, we're sitting here talking about, this letter, 1 Corinthians, written somewhere around 54, probably. When did Jesus die? 30? So if Jesus dies in 30, we're looking at 24 years later that Paul's writing this letter. By the way, it's one of the earliest writings of the New Testament, only predated perhaps by 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Galatians. And Galatians, if it's the earliest, probably around 50. So you're still 20 years before any writings are going out to the church. Not everyone was endowed with the gift of the Holy Spirit of revelation. So, they had to memorize these things. And a lot of the early, early formulas, many believe, for example, the first 4 verses of 1 Corinthians, death, burial, and resurrection, that is an early Christian formula to help people remember the significance of Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection. Things like that. And maybe this is another one here. So, we have this idea of what is sown. Well, what is the what? That which is sown. The what? That's a pronoun. It's referring to something. The body. Yeah, I think you're right, Terry. The body is sown, which is sown, is perishable. What is raised, the body which is raised, is imperishable. We know that for certain as we get down to verse 44. But what is sown is one thing, what is raised is another. And so what is sown is dishonor, is in dishonor. What is raised is in glory. What is sown is in weakness. It is raised in power. Now, let's first ask the question, what does he mean by sown? If we're talking about the body, and I think Terry's right, in what sense is the body sown? Put in the ground. I think that is probably the most common idea, that it is put in the ground. Now, what's interesting is in earlier when he talks about planting the seed, he says what you sow, and that's in the active voice. You are doing the sowing. You are doing the sowing. But he shifts here to a passive voice, to what is being sown. I don't think that he's talking about what we as human beings are sowing. I think he's talking about what God is sowing. Now, I don't think this would necessarily, cause us to break fellowship over this, but here's what I think he's talking about in light of the context. Because in verse 45, he brings up something he's already brought up before, which is what? Look at verse 45 real quick. It's the difference between Adam and who? Christ. The first Adam, the second Adam, right? The first one, the second one. He's already brought up that idea. I think that what is sown here is actually human life in the first Adam. When we procreate, what are we doing? Through the intercourse of a husband and wife, we are literally sowing the seed. Right? That's what it's described as, especially in the Bible. That was the in Galatians 3:15. That promise of the Messiah that was going to come, that was so extraordinary, because he tells the woman that I will put enmity between his seed and her seed. And he uses that feminine pronoun, her seed. And yet, biologically speaking, and throughout the rest of the Bible, by the way, the woman doesn't have a seed. The seed is always with the man. And so he plants the seed in the womb of the woman, and children are produced. That's how the Bible depicts relations and the child. So if you take God planting the seed of humanity, now think about that. Is humanity or human life since Adam until now, is it perishable? Is it dishonored in sin? Is it weak? Is it natural? We'll get to that word natural in a moment too, because it's an interesting word. I would say yes, it is. And so God has planted what the body as it is, this human life on this earth, and we have turned it into perishable. The word perishable, has the idea of the ability to die or perish. Some translations use the word corruption or corruptible, and so the idea really is the idea of dissolve. What is sown is dissolvable. It's perishable. It's corruptible. It decays, we might say. And certainly in this life, even while we are, quote, living, we are dying, right? Any of you dust the coffee table every once in a while? Do you know what you're wiping off? Yeah, there's some dirt and lint. But you know what the biggest part of it is? It's you. Right, it's skin cells. Because our skin cells are dying and they slough off and they get into the air and you breathe them and you drink them and eat them. And I know it's not a pretty thought, but let's be honest. And it falls on the top of the coffee table. And so we wipe that off from time to time because it's gross. And so we're alive, but we are dying. We are perishing. We are decaying even now. But when it is raised, in that moment that it is raised up, that resurrection that he's been dealing with, it is raised incorruptible or imperishable. It's not going to do that anymore, right? It is sown in dishonor. And so we go back to the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3. Man has sinned. He is ashamed before God. Remember, he clothed himself in fig leaves because he was ashamed. And then, of course, God comes and says, the fig leaves ain't quite enough. Let's give you a little more clothing than that. And so put on, full aprons of clothes. Sadly, we've gone back to fig leaves many times. So what is sown in dishonor, but it is raised in glory. What God brings forth is going to be glorious, right? Now, Paul normally uses this word doxa in reference to God. But now he's going to use it in reference to the resurrection. He's already used it with the glory of one kind of body and the glory of another kind of body and so forth. The same idea here, but now it's raised in full glory. It is sown in weakness. Paul says, "Oh, wretched man that I am. For the very things that I want to do, I don't do. And the things I don't want to do are the very things that I do." What's he talking about? This internal struggle that he has and an inherent weakness that we as human beings have through the lust of our flesh. Okay, it is sown a natural body, is raised a spiritual body. Now, the word natural here comes from this word, sukikon. And it is raised a pneumaticon. But what's interesting here is, I think generally when we read that, we think, oh, well, natural, that means our flesh and bone, and that's the kind of body that's sown. But it's going to be raised some ethereal vapor. I think that's what Paul is combating in this entire context. It's not raised an ethereal vapor. It is raised what? As a body. The same body? Well, in a moment he's going to tell us it's going to be changed. But I think this is where we get into that continuity, discontinuity discussion again. In other words, there's obviously some continuity between the body, from this earth, once it dies and is buried, and continuity with the body that is resurrected, right? What's the first fruit of the resurrection? Christ Jesus, right? That's what Paul says earlier in this context, is he became the first fruits of the resurrection. And was he seen after his resurrection? For 40 days, right? What did he tell Thomas? Thrust your hand in the spear wound in my side. Put your fingers in the nail prints of my hand. When in John chapter 21, when Peter had given up, I'm going fishing, guys. And, we'll go too. So they all jump in the boat with him. They're out fishing. And Jesus shows up on the beach. And what's he doing? He's cooking. And Peter jumps out of the boat. Everyone else rows to shore, but Peter can't wait that long. He jumps out and swims to shore. And he gets there. And they enjoy this meal together. Did Jesus eat? When he took a bite of fish, did it just fall to the ground because he's an ethereal spirit? There was continuity between his body before death and his body after resurrection. Is it exactly the same? I don't think so. Because in John 20, they're in an upper room and the doors are locked, and what happens? Jesus just appears right there in the midst of them. Did he aspirate there? If we're going to go with Harry Potter language, did he walk through a wall to get there? I don't know. But his body, there's some discontinuity between the two. And I would say that with our bodies, it's the same way. I don't think that he says in verse 44, the natural body and spiritual body, that he is talking about composition. That the body was natural, it was flesh, it was material, and now it's going to be a spiritual body in the sense that it's made up of spiritual vapors. I don't think that's what Paul is saying. I think what Paul is talking about is for the location they inhabit, earthly and heavenly, right? He's made that distinction in verse 40, earthly and heavenly. What kind of body inhabits the heavenly? One that is, we might say, controlled by the Spirit. By the way, this word here is most often translated in the New Testament as soul. And what do we say the soul does? We say, man, we're made up of body, soul, and spirit. From 1 Thessalonians 5, body, soul, and spirit. Jesus even said, if you love God with what? All your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. Strength refers to the body, the soul refers to the soul, the spirit refers to the mind and the heart. And so, there you have the three parts of man. Now, I think sometimes we say, I have a body. Well, technically, I don't have a body. I am a body. Because my body is as much part of me as my soul is, as my spirit is. It's all me, right? So I am a body, I'm a soul, and I'm a spirit. And that goes for each one of us. Now this gets into some heady stuff, I understand. If I had a good joke, I'd insert it here to bring your minds back, but I don't. So the natural body is simply the not the composition, but the purpose of the body. The purpose of the body on the earth, the natural body, the soulish body, the animated body. I think we most often talk about the soul animating the flesh. The animated body that we have on this earth while we're here, when it's sown, by the way, go back and this is, Ron, one reason why I think that being sown is more than just the burial at the grave, is we don't bury animated bodies. If we understand, the word soul here, soulish, it's an adjective. It's put in an adjective form here. So a soulish body or an animated body or something like that. And that's not what we're burying. We're burying a body after it has left that realm of the living. Again, I don't think it's something to quarrel over anything, but that would be my understanding of it. So this natural body, this body of the soul, was fit and appropriate for the earth, but the resurrected body, the one that is raised, is going to be fit and appropriate for heaven. So the glory of one and the glory of the other, they are different. And if there is a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. If there is a body which was natural to this earth, the idea is in the life to come, there is a body that is natural for the life to come. Now, he's going to say in a moment that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. And so we're going to have to deal with that. I don't know if we'll get there tonight, but we're going to have to deal with that somehow. But what Paul wants them to see is that it's not just a release of the spirit from the body. There is a resurrection of us. And if in the earthly part, the natural part, I am body, soul, and spirit, then in some way, there's a continuity of body, soul, and spirit. Right? Now, I realize we haven't got that far, but let's go just a little. Any questions or comments on that? And listen, if you disagree with me, I understand. These are not easy things. Ivan, go ahead.
And I may be getting ahead of you, but the definition of death is a separation, correct?
Of body and spirit, James 2:26.
Death. Okay, then, and there's going to be a resurrection. Something is going to raise.
Yes.
Now, is the soul, where is the soul?
Okay, great question. Very important question. So, if we say, here's our body, it's a little crude, I realize. So here's our body, and inside that body is this animating force of the soul, right? And I think in James 2, when he says that, just as the body apart from the spirit is dead, I think the word spirit, as often is used in the scriptures, sometimes is equal to or is representative of both the soul and spirit. Sometimes, it's depicted as being separate and distinct, which I believe it is, but because they are so similar, soul and spirit are oftentimes just lumped together. And I think that's the case here in James chapter 2. So, the idea is that at death, this spiritual part leaves. That's why the body dies, right? So this is happening. And so, if a body is raised and we're simply turned into a spirit form, why raise the body? If we're already separated into body and spirit, that's my spirit form. If this death right here results in these two things, why bring this thing back into the body only to have it do what? Leave the body again. Seems like that's already happened. That's why the body is dead. It doesn't make sense in my mind to bring the spirit back into the body, resurrect the body, just to slough off the body and become a spirit again. First Terry and then Diana.
In the beginning, weren't we made to have a soul and body and live forever on this earth, though?
Yes.
So see, that's why.
Yes. Now you're getting into another discussion we may or may not get into, but definitely not tonight, but maybe in next week's or two.
I know this isn't probably too accurate, but I just kind of thought of the concept of metamorphosis.
Okay.
Caterpillar versus a butterfly. And you kind of think of the concept that the holisticness of, let's say, its soul and its spirit still retain itself in the butterfly, it just takes on a different morph. And if you think of that, maybe we can kind of transcend that same concept into, what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
At least makes it more logical, but not directly.
Yeah. I think you're right on. Because remember, meta means to move across. And morphos, or morphe in the Greek, means form. To change form. And that's what we're doing. We're changing form. And that's spelled out very clearly in verse 52, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, or in a blink of an eye.
Back to mine, so what are you saying then, the soul stays?
I'm saying that at the resurrection, what was separated at death, James 2:26, is reunited at resurrection. And I would say that we keep that body in its changed form. Not exactly as it is here, but with whatever continuity and discontinuity between this body and that body we retain.
So then our eternal body, I'm going to use that term, is in the grave.
Will be resurrected. Our eternal body will be resurrected. And it will be eternal because of the change.
I know, but there's probably not an answer, but I mean, you die and you raise.
Right.
But there's a lot of time
So,
in there between is what I'm saying.
Your spirit will not be resurrected in someone else's body.
Oh.
Paul is making it clear that your body is going to be raised. The body you have now will be raised. and it will be changed into your eternal body. It's still your body, though. And he's very clear that there is a body here, and that's important. Chris?
Well, and it kind of goes back to what you're talking about. You put a kernel in the ground, and the kernel doesn't come back out of the
No.
ground. It's a different form. So the same essence. I mean, your body there. I mean, after a certain amount of time, it's just bones.
But everything that is in that plant was in that kernel.
Right. But your bones aren't going to raise up as just bones. You're going to have to become
Right.
up with something different. So it's going to be that eternal body that comes out.
You know, those who died in a flaming car accident, you know, or have their bodies cremated, God is able to, I believe, reconstitute that body. That's its resurrection. And that resurrection is not just a mere animation of the flesh. It is a reunion of our soul or spirit with our body. And then that body is changed. We're all going to change. In fact, he uses that language in just a few verses. We'll all be changed, but we'll still be us. I'll still be me, and I'll still have some form of this body. Flesh and blood? I don't think so. Verse 51, is that right? 50? Verse 50? Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So, not the same, but the same. Now, here's one to chew on. If Jesus is fully God and fully man, and he's now ascended into heaven as the first fruits of the resurrection, I would say he's also the first fruit of ascension, of dwelling with God. What kind of body does Jesus have? I would say he has the body we will have. He has the body that we will have. How long will he have that? From the time he became the incarnate one, he's man. And remember we talked about Gregory of Nyssa's statement, what is not assumed is not redeemed. We are redeemed body, soul, and spirit because Jesus assumed body, soul, and spirit. He continues as both God and man since the incarnation. I find that profound. Maybe it's not. Maybe you've understood that all your life. That's not something I understood all my life. And whenever it dawned on me what is happening in the emptying, the kenosis of Philippians 2, to me that's just a profound sacrifice that he made for us. We say he took upon himself the limitations of man, or limitations of the servant, and he still has those same limitations of a servant that we will have when we are resurrected. Whatever they are. And I think Paul is speculating in a sense here. He's not giving us the full story. Wouldn't you like to have the full story? What's the composition of that body? What's how much does it weigh? How is it different? He's not giving us all of that. He really just gives us 4 attributes, doesn't he? It's spiritual, it's powerful, it's glorious, and it's imperishable. That's what he tells us about the body. But that's central in Paul's mind. And I think we ought to keep it central as well to Christian principles. Christianity is the resurrection of Christ and the future resurrection that we will share in. Okay, we're going to have to stop there. I know we're way over time, but we'll look at all of the other, the from heaven of dust and things like that that is in this passage. If you would, bow with me for a word of prayer as we finish tonight. Our Holy Father, we are blessed